Well, welcome this evening. I'm so excited to have you here for the third installment of our Heroes Lecture Series. You probably know me. I'm Kate Swanson, Interpretation and Public Engagement Educator here at the museum. In 2023, our Heroes theme is concerned with celebrating the courage of people moved by conviction, truth, and love to improve communities, societies, and our worlds. The effect of heroes is subtle and monumental, local and global, and lingers long after they are gone. What you might not know is that our speaker tonight is the one who primarily crafted that annual theme language. After two of our wonderful Smithsonian speakers in January and February, we're now turning for the last two talks to some more local knowledge. After tonight, there's just one more talk in our regular lecture series. On Wednesday, April 12th, Talima Aaron, who is the board president of the John W. Jones Museum, will join us to speak about his incredible legacy. And make sure to check, of course, our website and our emails for all the other upcoming programs. In the last two talks, both of which are now available to view and share on our YouTube channel, we talked about fictional heroes and climate heroes. This evening, we're going to consider simultaneously two different types of real heroes, artists and mothers. And if you haven't had the opportunity to check out the special exhibit from our permanent collection, Motherhood, it's right across the hall here. So we have a beautiful sightline to the artwork that kind of sparked this whole presentation tonight. So if you haven't yet, definitely walk across and check that out. That exhibition was one of our speaker's last projects in her most recent role as curator of collections and exhibitions here at the Rockwell. Many of you know Kirsty Buchanan, but may only know a small slice of her impressive arts career. During her tenure here at the Rockwell Museum, Kirsty oversaw the reinterpretation of the permanent galleries, crafted a new collection development plan to shepherd the Rockwell's change in mission, and guided over 400 acquisitions to the collection as a result. 400, just in case. Okay, thanks. She also successfully co-authored this institution's application to the Smithsonian Affiliates Program. Kirsty's scholarship has been broad, and we are excited that this evening we can talk about the broad range of it. It's been focused on American paintings, drawings, and sculpture from 1850 to 1945, with a concentration on Hudson River School, early modernism, and regionalism. But her postgraduate work was grounded in classical studies, and she served as a graduate research assistant for the Mugello Valley Archaeological Project's excavations at Poggiacola, an Etruscan Bronze Age temple complex in central Italy. Her community involvement in that area has also been equally full. Kirsty serves as an art advisor to the Center for the Mark Twain Studies Historic House, on the advisory board for WSKG Media, and as the collection committee chair for the Corning Painted Post Historical Society. And as many of you know, she's continuing her commitment to our community in a new role as the executive director of 171 Cedar Arts Center. Before I officially turn the mic over, please be sure to take a moment to make sure any of your devices are silent or turned off. Note our emergency exits are in the back of the room here. Make sure to hold on to your questions for Q&A with Kirsty at the end of the talk. And with that, please help me welcome my friend, Kirsty Buchanan.
Thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. I'm gonna stow my water. The curators are always, or former curators are always the worst about having drinks in the gallery space, as you know. And thank you to Brian Lewis-Hunt, the executive director here at the Rockwell, for having me back and hosting me. This was a lecture that I was very excited to do, and I'm thrilled to be able to do that still, even though I come as a guest. So the topic of my lecture you see here tonight, and it is really grounded in one of the favorite acquisitions that I was able to work on during my tenure at the Rockwell Museum, a work by Elizabeth Catlett. And so I think we're gonna get to learn a lot about that tonight. Catlett is recognized as one of the most celebrated artists of the 20th century, and her stylized figures reflect a collective pride in her African American culture and her identity as a woman. And we see the Rockwell's work here. And as Kate had mentioned, this is conveniently located just across the landing. Catlett is a celebrated printmaker and sculptor who used her art as social commentary and political criticism at a time when women, especially African American women, were systemically marginalized in society. This bronze is currently on view, and I want to just take a moment to share with you all kind of my methodological approach to the scholarship. I tend to always lean into a socio-historical lens through which I view things, so that's kind of the journey that we're going to go on tonight. And I've broken this up into 3 parts, really wanting to look at the artist, the object, and the inspiration. So we're going to start with the artist. And an object always takes on more meaning when we consider who it was made by. Catlett was born at Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Her father was a math professor at the Tuskegee Institute and sadly died before she was born. Her mother trained as a teacher, and both parents were very well educated. Catlett grew up hearing her grandmothers talk about being enslaved, and this really lands hard with me because I think of the influence that my own grandparents instilled with me about their childhoods and their lived experiences. As a child, Catlett wanted to be an artist, and this is remarkable because this was at a time when museums throughout the South still prohibited admission to African Americans. Catlett attended Howard University, where she graduated with honors in 1935, earning a bachelor's degree in art, and then went on to the University of Iowa, where she earned a Master of Fine Arts in 1940. And another artist that is featured in our collection also was at the University of Iowa at the same time, Grant Wood. She studied with Grant Wood, a great American regionalist printmaker. And the advice that he gave her was to paint what you know. A central work in her master's thesis exhibition was a limestone carving titled Negro Mother and Child. And this theme that emerged so early in her scholarship and her studies would continue to permeate her entire body of work. And here we see her working a wonderful image of her on a portrait bust. Now, pictured on the left is the limestone carving Negro Mother and Child from 1940. And Catlett submitted this work to the American Negro Exposition in Chicago of the same year. The work was accepted into the juried show, and Catlett won first prize in sculpture, a critical recognition for any artist fresh out of graduate school. Then she moved to New Orleans and joined the art faculty of Dillard University, serving as the chair of the art department. At that time, there was a traveling Picasso exhibition touring the US, and it was on view at the Delgado Museum in City Park, now the New Orleans Museum of Art. Catlett wanted to take her students to this exhibit, but as we mentioned previously, people of color were not allowed in either the City Park or the Delgado Museum. So after contacting numerous city and university officials, she was able to make special arrangements to take her students on a day when the museum was closed. And what they had to do is kind of shocking to contemporary audiences. They chartered a bus to drive them through the park to the loading dock entrance of the museum, where they were unloaded out of sight and not technically stepping foot into the city park. Yeah. What they saw was the groundbreaking exhibition, Picasso, 40 Years of His Art. And this was a turning point in 20th century art. While war was raging in Europe, the show was touring the United States. It started at MoMA, went to Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, and New Orleans. And here is a wonderful installation picture from the MoMA website, as well as the published catalog that went with that exhibition. So archives have shown us exactly what would have been on view, and there's some wonderful parallels looking at what Catlett saw and watching for those influences to surface in her art. So I want to plant that in your minds as we move forward. And this painting, 1937, a piece that was inspired by the war in Spain. So in 1946, so 6 years later, Catlett received a Rosenwald grant, which funded production of a print series she was working on titled The Negro Woman. This is one of the images from that series. And you can see this theme emerging in her work. Women, daily life, elevating the mundane and the trivial to the level of high art. She went to Mexico on this grant to work on the series and was the guest artist in residence at the internationally recognized Taller de Gráfica Popular, or the People's Graphic Arts Workshop. In Mexico, she met and married fellow artist Francisco Mora, and Catlett became a Mexican citizen in 1962 and then remained in Mexico for the rest of her life. And what was going on in America at that time, the US government's increasing attacks on social activists, artists, and intellectuals during the Cold War definitely had to have influenced her decision. And for a period of time, they had confiscated her passport, so she was not even legally able to return to her country of birth. Catlett went on to teach sculpture at the Escuela Nacional de Artes Plásticas, and when she was hired, the male professors protested her appointment as a woman, as an African American, and as a foreigner. She endured and thrived there, retiring successfully in 1975, leaving a very strong legacy. And here is a wonderful image that has appeared on the label of the work in the Rockwell Museum of her and her son, Francisco. Baby face. Catlett's art is grounded in what she knew, based on first-person experiences with oppression, exploitation, racism, and misogyny. While she explored a wide range of social and political themes in her work, she is really best known, I would venture to say, for her tender and intimate representations of African American motherhood. Catlett's mother and child subject matter unifies a career that spans 7 decades. And now the artwork. And the art of looking always begins with questioning. What influenced Catlett? What inspired her? What was she responding to that was part of the canon? So, remembering MoMA in 1940, here's another installation shot and a featured detail titled Woman's Head, Fernande, from 1909. And these are works, and this is like the art historical smoking gun, to be able to know exactly the works that an artist was exposed to. And looking at some of the Cubist pieces and the influence that African art is already emerging and starting to become visible in Picasso's work. And we know that Catlett saw these because the exhibition was consistent from its opening at MoMA to the tour that came through New Orleans. Another painting that was part of that exhibit, the Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, is kind of the textbook example of Picasso's inspiration and influence by Western African masks. And the masks are so highly abstracted, and these depictions of the human form really are foundational to the development of European Cubism. And sorry, I wanted to point out too that this work, while it was part of that tour, was also acquired. You can see in the acquisition numbering, it was acquired by MoMA that same year. So I think that's nice continuity. Now, looking across the pond here in America, an example here by Alexandra Calder also shows the prevalence African art was having as an influencer of early 20th century American modernism. It was being acquired by collectors and museums and slowly diffusing from Europe through America, where it was really received as new and exotic in both of these contexts. And its artistic influence permeated mid-century popular culture. As we see here, the Sid Avery photograph of Marlon Brando. I love this. If you look up over his shoulder, you can see a contemporary work of African wood carving. But what specific origins? What was inspiring this? Here is, we're going to be looking at a series of objects that are part of the Metropolitan Collection. This is an example of an Edo, or present-day Nigerian pendant. It's very naturalistically rendered, very early. This is a 16th century work, and highly representational. Just a beautiful, lovely image of a human face. And something, I'm just full of these little side notes, but you all stay with me. The provenance history of this piece is staggering. And by researching that, you can trace the colonization of Africa by the British Empire and the movement, the funneling of these objects that we're still talking about now, the Benin bronzes and Victoria and Albert holdings. We can trace the movement of them from Africa to Europe and from Europe here to American collections. It's a whole other field of scholarship. Another example here, also from the Met Collection, is a similar time period, but a different handling, much more stylized, with the patterned hair and the abstraction of the human features. And also something to remember is that these were, I think it's safe to say, brand new works that were being viewed by an American audience. African art was not included as part of the art historical canon being taught at that time, and still in many institutions it's not. Later periods, looking at more 19th and 20th century objects, show a full evolution towards abstraction, and these masks were functional as well as artistic, and again from the Met Collection. So having seen these, I think your eye can kind of fall on these two works, these sculptures done by Catlett, and see that she had knowledge of and she had familiarity with the Edo and the later West African mask. And she's taking these various influences and creating something entirely unique, harnessing her first-person perspective as an African-American woman. And these images are from the Catlett Foundation. Now, motherhood. Iconography. We use this word, we throw this around, and it is one of those art historical terms that we try to demystify also. This is the visual language of symbols and images used in art that represent deeper layers of meaning or alternate meanings. And back to the work in the Rockwell. Seated mother and child reflects this quiet dignity that stands in contrast to the violent oppression that faced African American women, their children, and their families. And the history of African American motherhood is marked by tenuous relationships that were constantly at risk of being severed through the forced movement of enslaved people. Families were separated, children were taken from mothers, and parents had no authority over themselves or their own children. Yet Catlett has represented African American motherhood sympathetically and with dignity. The child is cradled on the mother's lap, her hands cup around the child's waist protectively. The child leans back into the mother and his body relaxed. And I will be referring to the child as he, and that's really jumping off of the fact that Catlett's children were male. The drapery or fabric of the figures softly falls over their bodies and reveals the underlying forms. The child's head is on axis with the mother's breast, and his head turns in a gesture that almost anticipates nursing. The shortly cropped hair is stylized and reminiscent of the Edo sculptures we've just been looking at, but the features have been slightly abstracted, more in keeping with the later West African mask. And here we see an image of the work in its former home, the Contemporary Gallery upstairs from us. The image from the back shows more clearly the architectural chair that they are seated on. And this work is consistent with other examples of mother and child sculptures that were produced throughout Catlett's career. Here's another pair from the Catlett Foundation. And something to note as we look at these, the limited access to materials and lack of gallery representation, museum exhibit opportunities, and lack of patronage led artists of color and women artists to work in non-traditional materials, such as terracotta or wood. And the cost of bronze casting was really beyond the reach of many minority and women artists in the 20th century. It wasn't until later in her career that Catlett had the means to produce her models in bronze. And then looking at these two, I want to ask, what other meaning can we derive from the works? What precedent was Catlett responding to? Looking again to an African precedent, and a lot of encyclopedic museum collections will separate their Egyptian collections from their African collections, but we need to remind ourselves and remember that these are all of the same continent. So looking again to an African precedent, for the modern observer, we distinguish between seated and enthroned, but in the ancient Mediterranean world, the iconography of sitting very specifically denoted enthroned, and it was a way to visually communicate kingship, power, and authority. This life-size statue depicts Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh, and she wears some of the trappings of Egyptian power and authority, the Nemes headcloth and the Shindant kilt, items that again would have been typically worn by a man. And here's another example of Egyptian iconography. We see in the relief carving the architectural chair that the figure is sitting on. And through extensive trade, Egyptian art was diffused throughout the Mediterranean world and was highly influential to a lot of other cultures. An example from ancient Greece is this Panathenaic kylix depicting the canon of Greek gods. And we can see in the center of the register the figure of Zeus. And we know it's Zeus because of the inscriptions next to each figure, but we also could identify him because he is the only one that is seated. He's shown enthroned and elevated above his peers as the king of the gods. Now, a bit of a shift. During the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, the cult of Isis rose in popularity, and this figurine depicts the goddess nursing her son Horus. The cult of Isis was exported back to Rome by the Ptolemies and became a powerful symbol of rebirth. And the iconography of rebirth or resurrection, specifically in a Roman context, would be influential to later religious movements. So, mother and child. We've talked a lot about the iconography of seated, of enthroned, but I want us to take a little bit of time and look at the iconography and the historical visual record of mothers and children. So using the faience figure that we just saw as the jumping off point, shifting our focus, and these representations, some images I've pulled for us to look at tonight, are really universal. They're universal throughout human existence, regardless of time period or culture. Through Egyptian and Tlahtiko, Greek, Chinese, Italian, and Dogon culture in current-day Mali. But the enthroned mother and child iconography of the cult of Isis was also seen by the early Christians in Rome. And scholars recognized the early church as being experts of marketing. They appropriated existing pagan imagery and holidays to better position the young church within mainstream culture, hopefully easing the path of converts. And the mother and child imagery was blended with the iconography of kingship along the cult of Isis model and evolved into what we recognize as virgin and child imagery. And here from left to right, we see examples from Carolingian period, French, Spanish, German, Italian. And the iconography was diffused. The iconography spread with the diffusion of Christianity throughout Europe, arriving in the Americas through colonization. Even after the Protestant Reformation, this iconography endured in a Christian context. Now, returning to Catlett's seated mother and child, we see that she has made a powerful statement on the universal sanctity of birth, motherhood, and nurturing. Catlett intentionally uses the ancient and well-established iconography of kingship and authority to present her seated mother and child. By using this loaded imagery, she presents the African American mother as a figure vested with authority and power. But Catlett also harnesses the iconography of the enthroned virgin and child, so well known in Western Judeo-Christian traditions. By presenting the African American mother and child as sacred, she elevates the universal role of motherhood, the act of parenting and nurturing children, as a divine act. Catlett has extended the sanctity of motherhood to all women, thus making it inclusive and instilling it with the capability of uniting women rather than dividing them. And I'd like to conclude with this lovely portrait of an older Elizabeth Catlett. Here she is shown seated, similar to the iconography that we've studied. Her pose is representative of motherhood and authority, although there is no child in her lap. She endures as a matriarch for her family, as well as women, artists of color, women artists, and future generations of African Americans. Thank you all very much. And Kate is, I think, getting ready for questions and conversation. And definitely being in this space, I think, is more conducive of that.
Absolutely. I have a microphone, but I think if Kirsty repeats everyone's questions, if you don't want to use it, you don't have to. It's pretty great acoustics in here. So I'm happy to take questions. Great.
I could probably speak loudly enough.
Okay.
So, Mother and Child was cast in
2008.
Do you know when it was first sculpted?
The accession record, I believe, has it modeled in 2008, and that it is consistent with the majority of her body of work. And as we were talking about with the limitation of access to materials, that it was only in her later life, once she had cultivated patrons that were helping her pay to have her earlier wooden and terracotta sculptures recast in bronze so that they would endure, they would be able to last longer than a very ephemeral terracotta statuette. That's why the date seems so late. But it's very consistent with any other marginalized groups of artists, that basically anyone that wasn't a white, straight man had difficulty getting gallery representation, museum exhibitions, positive feedback in the press and criticism, and yeah. You're welcome. Thank you. Good question.
So
Hi.
to follow up on that question,
Yes.
do we know what the original was created in, or does it still exist?
I don't believe that the bronze cast is a copy. It's not an exact rendering of any earlier work, but as we've seen so much of Catlett's body of work, she did not vary, and she did not stray too far from the path throughout her career. Now, she had her print work and her 2D, more political social commentary, but for her sculptures, she really leaned in and doubled down on this subject matter. And I would say the variations that we see are positioning of the figure. There are some where there's no throne, there's no seat. The figures are standing. Sometimes the woman is alone and it's just a celebration of African American womanhood. But very often it's mother and child. And they're so consistent. Even the early piece that we looked at, her master's thesis, limestone carving from 1940, that was her submission to the Negro exhibition, that this is just so ingrained in her work.
I was very impressed with your talk and with all that you knew about the artist and the background and how all this linked together. Had you actually been studying the artist well before the acquisition? Were you aware of her?
Nope.
Wow.
Not something that had really been in my field of research, but one of the wonderful opportunities that I had during my time as curator at the Rockwell to be able to continue learning. Every day something new, way outside of my comfort zone, but fascinating. And I think you all stayed with me on the journey tonight, and so bringing my background in classics to play a little bit with this, I was able to find common ground. And that was very interesting to me. But yeah, always learning, always being challenged. And I think that that's a good analogy for the purpose and the relevance of museums in our lives still today, that we need to be outside of our comfort zone. Yes?
I'm fascinated by your essentially continuous consideration of the chair as the king model, and I must admit I never would have thunk of it. She's got to sit someplace.
Right.
She can't always be standing. How sure are you that over the course of this event, it wasn't just a bunch of ladies sitting down, but really was this king business?
But it wasn't the wicker.
Sure. So my master's thesis was heavily grounded in a particular volute crater that was in the Dallas Museum of Art collection that had an iconographical register on the front of it of the figure of Atlas. And similar to the drinking Kylix cup that we looked at, the figure of Atlas was enthroned, but it was also inscribed. So we know that figure. And it was a puzzling research project. And I think my husband just dozed off because he's heard this before. I believe that was one of our first dates, was him getting to listen to me talk about the super awesome. He's nodding yes. But that the concept in an ancient world, and especially in the ancient Mediterranean world, was that if you were taking the trouble to design something, to create something artistically, everything was intentional. And that I don't think has changed in a modern context, but the way that we view it through our contemporary lens and our Western cultural lens, you know, it's very easy for us to dismiss it as it's just a chair. But when you stop and you think about it, and the next time you're in another institution, if you keep that lens and that filter in front of you and you're going through, you know, the Greek, the Roman, the Egyptian, the Western African galleries, you are not going to see, well, and we can go back. You're not going to see an underling or somebody outside of the highest levels of authority that's in a chair. Now, the exception to that I can think of is in a personal tomb, because a lot of the later kingdom tombs in Egypt, that might have been for a scribe or a priest. It will show an image of the deceased enthroned, and that's also consistent with funerary images in the Greco-Roman world. But this is very intentionally throwing all the stops out for the fact that this is Ramses I, this is his tomb, this is all of the bounties. Oh, where'd the pointer go? Oh no, I think it's out of juice. Well, in front of him, he's gesturing towards all of the bounties that have been assembled in his tomb in reality that are intended to help sustain him in the afterlife as well.
And she didn't sculpt herself sitting in like an armchair, right?
Right. And then the other image here, and this, the iconography also will sometimes be abbreviated to a stool. It looks like kind of a folding camp stool to us, but it is still inherently loaded with meaning. Yes, Lynn?
So the piece that we have, it seems like the figure is fairly stylized and abstract, but I was struck by the terracotta one that you showed, looked much more kind of individualized, like she maybe worked from a specific model. Did she work from models that are represented, or was most of her work abstract?
I think that's a great question. I don't know whether she used models. I see kind of a universal type almost as the result of her work. Now, she probably, with the training and the studies that she did, I'm sure that she would have been exposed to life drawing, and she would have been working from, a live model at times. I don't know, that's a good question. I don't see in her sculptures an individualized physiognomy that would make me think that it's a direct portrait, but it's more of a type. It's like an archetypal image to be every woman, every child. And I think as a viewer, when we come across those images, it is an easier access point for us to identify with them on a personal level, rather than if it was a portrait that would be very much of an other. That's not me. But because it is more generic, I hate to use that term, but I think it's an entry point. And it's this beautiful mix of a naturalistically rendered figure that is also slightly abstracted. And that can be kind of a struggle for us to see both of those qualities in these works.
Time for a couple more. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask another question?
Of course.
Do you know approximately how many sculptures she created in her career?
Oh, I do not. I know she was very prolific. Brian, do you have any? Okay. And also we have to remember that the bulk of her work and her mature production from like 1946 to 1975 and beyond was done in Mexico. So that there are huge collections of her work that are not of our country. That we were not interested in cultivating her and supporting her as a working artist at the time. That also lands really powerfully with me. And we claim her as an American. She's in the Rockwell collection. She was born here. But as we kind of alluded to throughout the presentation, there were periods, long periods of time where her US passport had been confiscated when she left the country, which I've never had that happen to me. That would be a terrible feeling. So yeah, that's a whole other lecture topic.
Did she ever return to the US later in her life?
I believe that she moved back here permanently after her husband died. Does that sound?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I'm thinking, but that they stayed in Mexico. That's where they raised their children. They both worked there. I don't know that she would have had a lot of opportunities to teach at a university level in America during that time period. I feel like it was impressive that she was so well educated and accomplished before she moved to Mexico. Thank you all so much. I've enjoyed being able to speak with you tonight, and before you leave, I would encourage you to just step across the landing and you can see this beautiful sculpture because images never do the artwork justice. Thank you all so much.